Are we ready? Hey everyone, welcome. I think we're ready to start. Are we ready to start? Okay. Welcome everyone. Today I'm going to be talking about a topic called finding alpha. And the objective of this discussion today is to talk about how do you find competitive advantage in the current market. And so when we think about the mobile gaming industry right now, I think what we've all been experiencing is a market that's in trouble, right? So there's been a lot of layoffs. There's been a lot of things happening in the industry that makes the industry in which we're competing today very, very difficult. And so one of the things I want to talk about today is how do we think about finding competitive advantage given that the industry is so dynamic, is so changing, and so complicated. Next slide, please. How do I advance the slides? Do I just tell you guys, or do you guys have a clicker or something? Oh, you haven't received my presentation. I sent it. Oh.
Maybe you could just forward it. Email.
Yeah. Okay, so my presentation seems to be missing. So let me try and send it to them. All right, guys. Slight technical difficulty here as we're getting the presentation loaded, hopefully. All right, so while they're getting the presentation loaded, maybe I can find out how many game developers in the audience here? Okay, it's like everybody. Any publishers? No publishers? Any investors? All right, so a lot of developers and I assume founders of game studios, so that's great. How are we doing on the presentation? Got it? Yeah, I would say one of the things that we're going to talk about when it comes to alpha is that I specifically called out these 4 areas around product growth and live ops. And I'll talk about it later, but when you think about the mobile gaming industry today, I would say that the key bases of the competition are really, like one way to view it is around these 3 pillars. So product meaning, the quality of the product, how good the game is. Growth, which is user acquisition and marketing. And live ops, like how do you actually operate the game. And I think the other area that's having a huge impact in the industry is AI, and we'll talk about specifics of how AI is impacting game development as well. Are you close on the presentation there? Okay. Looking like we're getting closer, I think. Okay. Are we good? Oh, here it is. All right, we got my presentation. Okay, so whoops, this is the wrong one, but that's okay. Okay, I think I sent you the wrong one. I made one for IGDC specifically, but that's fine. All right, so I wanted to first open the discussion today by going over a quote by a famous business school professor in the 1960s and 70s. His name was Lilan C. Megginson. And he was speaking on Darwin's book, The Origin of Species, and he basically said the following. It is not the most intellectual of the species that survives. It is not the strongest that survives. But the species that survives is the one that is able best to adapt and adjust to the changing environment in which it finds itself. And so I'd like you in the audience to think about this quote as we continue our discussions today, because I do think that in the current market, when we think about our industry that is so dynamic, that is so complex and changing, there's a lot of companies who are now not making it, right? They're not succeeding with their games. And so it is going to be those companies that are able to best adapt and adjust that will survive. And it's essentially very, very evolutionary, right? Like we are operating in a very difficult, competitive operating environment. So I would submit to you that these are the times when you really want to think about the competitive environment and not just on execution. And so I'll explain that in the presentation later today. And just quickly about me, one way that you can think about my experience and expertise is really around 3 areas. The first is in game publishing, where I led publishing at NBC Universal, as well as Sega. In game development, I founded a studio 5 years ago in Bangalore called Lila Games. We're working on a mobile extraction shooter, as well as a dating simulation game for the Indian market, which one will soft launch into this year and one will hard launch into this year. Previous to that, I worked at a company called Fun Plus, which was a Chinese-based game studio. And so I got to experience firsthand around 2015 how the Chinese market was developing. And my hope is that similar to how the Chinese gaming market developed, I'm hoping that that happens here in India as well. Finally, on the content side, I have a podcast and newsletter called Game Makers. And some people may or may not be familiar with the podcast that I started for the Deconstructor of Fun called This Week in Games. Okay. So something else to just kind of add here is that the discussion today is going to be more conceptual and speculative in nature. So I think there's probably a lot of other talks that are going to be a lot more tactical and practical, and I think those are very valuable. But just so you know, I'd like to focus our discussion today on more of the strategy that will be required to be successful in today's market, because we are entering an age of uncertainty. And I think, again, in these times when you have a dynamic, complex, and changing market, it is, in my opinion, a lot more important to focus on the macro, the competitive operating environment. And I'll explain the concept of macro versus micro in a few slides from now. Okay, and just to frame our discussion today, so I'll talk about this concept of macro, which is speaking to the competitive environment in which we're operating today in the mobile games industry. I'll then talk about a few concepts related to how do you compete effectively in the current environment. I'll then talk about some history lessons, so some case studies of companies that were able to be successful in the mobile gaming industry and what we can learn from some of those lessons. And finally, I will then talk about this concept of alpha, or how do we find areas where we can have some kind of structural or competitive advantage. Okay, starting with macro. And so the way that I view the current macro environment in our industry today is really around kind of 5 key macro trends. And the first is the rise of China. And so I mentioned that I worked at a company called FunPlus, but in 2015, China was not as dominant as they are today. And so that was a market and an industry that has come to really dominate the gaming industry. And it was through their work ethic, it was through lower cost structure, it was through investment in gaming and aggregating and developing skill and talent in game development since, over the last 10, 15 years. I think the second trend that we can talk about is the attention economy. And what this means is that when we're working in game development, especially for new games, we're no longer just competing against other new games, right? And so, for example, there are now live operated games doing better than ever. And so like whether it's Fortnite or League of Legends or other games that really take a lot of player attention, new games not only have to compete with other new games, but with existing live operated games. And in addition to that, even outside of gaming, you have things like video on demand, Netflix, Amazon Prime, YouTube, as well as social, like TikTok, Instagram. And so in the current market in which we are competing, the attention economy suggests that there is so much competition for players' time that we have to really think about how do you position yourself to attract a player's attention. And again, this is the new environment in which we're operating. The third trend is the age of efficiency. And so, a few years ago, it was a lot easier to be able to raise funding for game development. We were in a ZIRP environment, zero interest rate policy environment. So money was essentially almost free, and there was a lot of overinvestment in the games industry. And so during that time, you didn't really need much to get started. We overinvested, and there were a lot of practices that I would argue that we supported that were not very efficient or effective. But when it comes to today, now capital is drying up to invest in game development. Now we have to actually operate in a much more efficient and effective way, given that there's fewer, at least in the current time, there are a lot fewer resources available to game developers. And so you actually do have to work a lot more efficiently and a lot smarter than we had to before. And then fourth is the resurgence of live ops. And so one of the things that we really that we saw that was very surprising was last year, and I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with this, but Brawl Stars, which was a game that had been live operated for many years and was on decline, all of a sudden 6x their revenue and hit all-time highs in revenue. Clash Royale in June earlier this year, also 6x revenue. They didn't hit all-time highs, but near all-time highs. And so what we're seeing is that the fourth macro trend that we have to think about is this resurgence of live ops and some of the techniques and tactics that are being used in live ops to take what was formerly games that were on decline and then turbocharging these games, revitalizing these games to basically drive performance, even from declining games that rival potentially starting a new game. And so many game studios today have to make this decision about resource allocation. Is it better for us to spend more money trying to build a new game, or do we reinvest that money and maybe shift the team that's been live operating an existing game and try to revitalize it, very similar to how many other companies are now revitalizing live ops for existing games? And finally, so I'll talk about some of these trends. The last one is about the AI revolution, and obviously many people believe, as I have believed, that AI is the most profound and potentially impactful technology ever in the history of humankind on Earth, possibly ever. And so I think there's going to be a lot of dislocations and a lot of changes in terms of AI and how that impacts game companies, and I'll probably save that one for the end of the presentation. All right, so going back and again, recalling that quote from Lian C. Megginson, it's important to now understand that, like, once you characterize your environment, and you may agree or disagree with me on these macro trends, but whatever your view is, once you characterize your operating environment, then you have to decide how do you react to that. Because again, it is those who are best able to adjust and adapt that will be successful in given a specific competitive environment. And so with the rise of China, you know, what are the competitive implications for that? How do you actually adapt and adjust? And so when I started Lila Games 5 years ago, one of the things that I realized is that I didn't think I could be successful developing a gaming studio in the West. I thought it was too expensive. I thought the work ethic wasn't there. And I just felt like a different model was necessary in order to be successful. When we talk about the attention economy, so then if you agree that we do live in an attention economy and it's harder than ever to attract a player's attention, well then what does that mean? And for us it means that we cannot do a game that's similar to other games. That meta is gone. That strategy, in my opinion, does not work. And so what we think about is how do we more strongly counterposition against incumbent games in the market today? And so I think that there has to be a lot more thinking with respect to if we're launching a game and it's slightly different from the existing games and you have fewer resources, how do you possibly compete? And so if you believe in this trend, what you would be thinking more about is how do you differentiate more strongly? And how do you try to capture that player's attention? Because distribution, UA, marketing, all of that is just getting increasingly more difficult in the current environment. Third is the age of efficiency. As I mentioned to you before, you know, resources are hard to come by. And so then you also have to think about how do you operate your studio as efficiently as possible. And finally, in terms of the resurgence of live ops, I think it becomes necessary now, and especially for free-to-play and mobile, that as you launch your game, in order to be successful, you do have to develop a lot of expertise and experience in how do you operate live ops as effectively as possible, because it's those games that are going to be running live ops successfully and effectively that are going to win, and those that don't will not win. Okay, so now I want to talk about a few specific concepts related to how do you compete in the existing market today. And I'll talk about three specifically, and the AI stuff I'm going to save for the end. But for now, I'm going to talk about a concept about alpha, which is the focus of our discussion today. I'll talk about this concept of micro versus macro. And third, I'll talk about something I'm calling playing to win, but it essentially studies kind of Elon Musk's strategy for how he operates his companies, and we'll try to learn a few lessons from the case studies from Elon. All right, so this notion of alpha I have borrowed from the finance industry. And so the equation that you're seeing on the screen right now is from what's called the CAPM, the capital asset pricing model equation. And it looks a little bit complicated, but the basis of this, the gist of this is that if you were to look at the return of an asset, and the asset could be like a stock, for example, like Tesla or Nvidia, and you think about the expected return, well, the way that you characterize that is by looking at the risk-free rate, meaning like the rate that you would get taking no risk. There's this notion of beta, which means the industry. And so as an example, when you think about Tesla, beta would be other companies similar to Tesla, like other automobile manufacturing companies, and yet Tesla significantly outperforms those companies because it doesn't do things like the other automobile manufacturing companies. It has what's called alpha, and alpha would then be the company-specific things that in this case, if we're looking at Tesla, that Tesla does that's different from the industry. And so just as a simplification, the way to kind of think about this is that for your company, your expected return would be the expected market return characterized by beta. What is the rest of the industry doing? And then offset by this notion of alpha. And I guess one of the things that I'd like for us in this room to consider today is that we are, again, in a distressed industry right now. Most of the companies are going out of business. And so if we're saying that this beta, if the industry and the way that the industry is operating is headed towards failure, then we really got to think about, then what are we doing that's different? How are we operating in a way such that we can differentiate ourselves from the rest of the industry, especially when we're in an industry that is so difficult and challenging? And so, again, I think the key thing that I'd like you to think about is if you accept the way that I've characterized the operating environment, which is difficult and challenging, and if you accept that many game companies in the industry today may be operating in a way that's not leading to successful outcomes, to positive cash flow generation, then I really do think it's important and incumbent upon many of you here, many founders here, to think about, then what is, to be really honest with yourself and to think about, what are we doing that's different? How are we going to succeed when so many other gaming studios are not going to succeed? Okay, so that's the concept of alpha, and now I want to talk about this concept of macro versus micro. And this concept was kind of popularized by RTS games, and here on the screen what you're seeing is, I think this is Warcraft 3. And essentially, when you're talking about an RTS game, there's a notion of micro and macro. Macro meaning the high-level strategy, like what buildings that you build. What kinds of technology do you research? Where are you going to put bases on the map? And so like the map control, the kind of resources that you build, those kinds of things are the macro. And the micro is a specific unit control. And so when you spawn units and you fight other units on a map, the specific control would be micro. And then when we think about the context from a company perspective, the macro then would be the high-level strategy, your company's philosophy, the general approach that you take for game development, things like that. And the micro would be the specific execution, the tactical execution, the practices and processes, the culture, how you actually execute your game development process. And what I'm saying is that if you're in an industry that doesn't change much, if you're in an environment that's relatively stable, micro is the most important. But when you're in an industry like we are in today, that's dynamic, that's changing, that's complex, then macro and thinking a lot more about the macro becomes increasingly important. Okay, third concept is this concept of playing to win. And I got this concept from Elon Musk, and he once posted that, or it was actually in an interview where he said, "My philosophy is that if you play to win. You don't play by half measure." And so let me highlight that specifically with two specific case studies or examples of how Elon played to win. And I know Elon's a little bit of a controversial figure, and I don't want to be political, and I generally am not political, but what I would say is that it's not controversial to say that Elon wins a lot. And so I would say it's then instructive to see how does he actually operate. And so last year in the US presidential elections, Elon came to the conclusion that the elections, and whether you agree or not, was very critical to Western civilization in that when his team studied the election, what they found is that Pennsylvania is the linchpin to the election. And so what did Elon do? Well, once he found what he thought was the point of maximal operating leverage, then he flew to Pennsylvania. He stayed there. He funded a lot of speaking events. He paid for things like busing Amish to polling stations. He held contests awarding like $1 million a day to different people. And you can see the graph on your right. The red shows the amount of Republicans minus Democrats that voted in Pennsylvania, and that gap between 2020 to 2024 was 600,000. So the point being that again, I don't want to get political, but the point being that if you're playing to win, this is the way to play. Meaning, what is the most important thing that can drive the success of your game studio or your game? What are the biggest fires, the biggest point of operational leverage, and then you just hammer that until you resolve that problem. And then you move on to the next point of biggest operational leverage, and you hammer that until you get that right. Now, the second case study from Elon is in AI, and many of you may be using Twitter or X, Grok, and may be familiar with X.AI, but one of the things with Elon is he came into the AI game late. I mean, he was the original investor and co-founded OpenAI, but he started getting into the AI LLM game very late. And this is a quote from Arvind Srinivas, who's the CEO of Perplexity. But I just wanted to highlight just how difficult this space is as characterized by Arvind when he posted, AI is a war zone. You only enter to win and die in honor if you die. There is no half-assing, no hedging, no strategic pivots. You have to keep at it, raise the bar consistently, and make the product better. Users are the spectators. No one is guaranteed to win at this point. But again, just highlighting the point that this is a very, very difficult industry. And so how did Elon try to compete in this space coming in very late? Well, I don't know if you are familiar with the essay, The Bitter Lesson, but if you're not, I would look it up. It's a very short essay. But one of the points from that paper is that when it comes to AI, that there are three key inputs. It's compute, parameters, and data. And then in some interviews with Sam Altman, he suggested that the LLM game would in the future be decided by distribution and customer habits. So what I'm characterizing here are the various factors that impact the success of a company that's operating in the AI LLM game. And so what did Elon do? Well, having identified these things, right? So he built the biggest supercomputer cluster in the world. And what that gave him is it gave him compute and parameters that were better than anyone else in the industry. And then he had xAI acquire Twitter, now X.com, and that gave him proprietary data. It also gave him distribution because there were already a lot of people using the Twitter X platform. And then these were people that were used to using X, and he's integrated Grok and X.AI capabilities into Twitter as well. And so again, the point I'm trying to highlight here is that as people in the games industry trying to compete for your specific game, for your specific company, what are these points? What are the points that will help you succeed? And then are you really playing to win? Or are you like the vast majority of the market, which I would argue basically just says, okay, hey guys, let's make a game. You know, we'll make this kind of game. And then you just kind of turn the crank without really thinking about, are you actually playing to win? What are the specific things that you need in terms of expertise, skills, or in terms of the product itself? And once you identify that, then pushing on that as far and as much as you can is what will actually be playing by full measures rather than by half measures. And it's something I think that not enough companies really think about critically or do, even though we may all be aware of it, right? And so as you're working on a game, you may know, your team may know that there are limitations or things that aren't right in the game, but then do you actually address those problems and do you actually work on them or not? And so, similar to the question I asked you about understanding your game studio's alpha, I would say, do you know what game you're playing? Have you identified the points of the highest operational leverage for you to be successful? And is your studio actually playing to win? Okay, now let's go down history lane and see some of the things that have happened in the mobile games industry since about 2010 or 11 or so, and see what they did. How many of you are familiar with Tapjoy? All right, good. So we got a few people. But one of the things that Tapjoy innovated upon was this notion of incentivized installs. And so they had things like offer walls and things like that so that you would get credits or coins for promoting other games. And when they first launched with this product, shortly after, for a time, this is around the 2012 era or so, in fact, Tapjoy was actually, anecdotally, what I heard, it was responsible for about half of all the installs on iOS. And so what we saw at that time then were the companies that leveraged Tapjoy, right? And so you had a new product that was driving half of the installs on iOS. And the companies that became aware of this model that went all in on this were actually a lot of folks that came from Tapjoy. And so whether it's StoreMate or TinyCo or Funzio, they were all living in the same city. They all became aware of this new distribution power and they all leveraged it to become successful at the time. And the second lesson here from history is a company called Appllift. And is anyone familiar with Appllift? Okay, so one person. What Appllift did back in the day, and this is probably closer to, I don't know, 2014 or so, is they innovated on taking affiliate marketing, which was popular on web, but they brought it to mobile. And by creating this product where you can push app installs through affiliate marketing was something new that Appllift did. And in fact, when we see the chart of Appllift's growth, which is in the red, and then the growth of King and Candy Crush Saga, and from some of the folks who I've talked to in Europe at this time, they mentioned that without Appllift, Candy Crush Saga and King would not have been as successful as they were. And so it's these kinds of issues where they were able to identify an alpha or a competitive advantage. And they fully leaned in on distribution at that time to drive them towards scale and success. Oops. So in this case, one was information. So if you were a game studio and you were aware of these new kinds of distribution and user acquisition capabilities, then you could win on distribution. And so there was an information advantage and a distribution advantage that came from these new innovations in the mobile gaming industry at that time. And the next example that I have from history is Game of War. So Machine Zone, and I don't know how many of you are old enough to remember this, but in kind of the 2012 to 2015, 16 time period, Game of War dominated. And when they first entered the market, in the 4X space, it was a game called Kingdoms of Camelot, which was like the #1 4X game at the time. And so one of the things that happened is that the then CEO of the company, which was called Admired at the time that became Machine Zone. The CEO, Gabe, flew to China with a friend of mine and studied the Chinese games in the market. And he looked at these games like ZT Online and Mir 2, a lot of these Chinese MMO games. And what he did is he took a lot of the monetization systems from these Chinese games, like VIP systems, Gold Bank, these different kinds of systems, and he basically just copied Kingdoms of Camelot, but then added these monetization systems into the game. And so with that, what happened? Well, he was then able to outspend Kingdoms of Camelot because they had higher LTV, higher ARPU. And because the mobile gaming user acquisition market is an auction-based market, they were able to essentially just take the market in terms of installs. And in this case, what happened is that you had Kingdoms of Camelot, which made what I heard was about $8 to $10 in LTV at the time. And by adding these new Chinese monetization systems, drive the LTV to 12 to 15, and then Game of War could outbid the rest of the industry in terms of 4X. And so in this case, the source of competitive advantage actually came from information in terms of monetization. One other example here is more recently in 2023, two major 4X games essentially stormed the market and created a huge renaissance in 4X gaming. And if you look at the top 3 games by revenue last year, 2 of the top 3 were Last War Survival and Whiteout Survival. And both of these games have generated over $2 billion in net revenue. And so that begs the question, well, how did they do that? How did the 4X space that was relatively flat to maybe even declining a little bit, how did they all of a sudden drive the market dramatically further in terms of revenue and growth? Well, the way they did that is that they realized that for a number of years, a lot of mobile gaming vendors started using fake ads. And they realized that they could attract a lot of players to fake ads and put them into a 4X game, for example, but then the conversion was not very good. And so the innovation that happened in terms of 4X was instead of making a fake mobile ad and pushing them to an unrelated game and getting a lot of churn, instead what they said is, guess what, we're gonna take this high-performing mobile game ad, we're gonna have that game that the players expect, and then we're gonna make a hybrid game. So then you come in from a mobile gaming ad that promotes a certain kind of game. That game is the early part of a 4X game, and then later you shift to 4X. And so you're getting like more casual players into the game, they get used to the game, and then you switch them to 4X, which is a much more highly monetizing game. And this happened at Century Games on Whiteout Survival, because if you go back, you'll see that actually Century Games launched a different game first. It was called Frozen City. And what they noticed in Frozen City is that all of the user acquisition, all the marketing was highly performant. And then they had this 4X game. And the 4X game was a complete disaster. It was a complete fail. But the innovation here that they implemented was then they said, okay, well, wait a minute. Frozen City is like this kind of idle game that doesn't monetize very well, but from a user acquisition and growth perspective, performs extremely well. So what if we took Frozen City, changed our 4X game, changed the theme to be like Frozen City, had that game be the early game, and then shifted players to 4X? And that's essentially what they did. And now when you look at a lot of the games from First Fun or Century Games, or now Fun Plus, which is the company I used to work at, they're all copying this model. This is the new meta. This is the new way of being able to dramatically increase the performance and monetization of 4X games. And so just kind of looking back at alpha, sources of competitive advantage, if we look at history, we see that it's come from information, it's come from distribution, it's come from monetization, and as in this last example, it's come from looking at growth and product and sort of like combining them together. Okay, and just to end the presentation, I wanted to, this last section is then about alpha. So where can we find alpha then? So you might be a game studio and you might not have fully characterized how are we competitively different, how do we have some kind of advantage in the market? And so that's what I'm going to be talking about now. And one way to think about this, and kind of the way that I think about it, and this is not the only way, but the way that I think about it, is again, at the beginning of the presentation, I talked to you about what I believe to be the 3 pillars of having a successful mobile game. And that's product, growth, and live ops. And on top of all this, we've got AI that's actually being integrated into these 3 different areas. But the way that I would think about alpha is, and what we're seeing today is from a product perspective, is like, can you do something like what Century Games did with Whiteout Survival? Can you potentially combine different groups, like combining product and growth, or combining product and live ops, or finding alpha with like product and growth in some way? And on the product side, what we've seen with respect to AI is companies trying to find new kinds of gaming experiences, right? And so things that you couldn't do before, but can we leverage AI to provide a different kind of product experience for the players? On the growth side, this is probably the area where I've seen AI being deployed the most, but you're seeing it used to create new kinds of creative concepts, to automate a lot of user acquisition as well. And then on the live ops side, I think what we haven't seen a lot of AI being deployed in live ops, but I think that's coming. And so when it comes to the use of agents, when it comes to a lot of things that are being done very manually in live ops today, I think all of that can be looked at by AI, and especially things that are very predictable. So one example of this is a battle pass. And so many games have a battle pass, and the thing about a battle pass is that it's very consistent. The kinds of rewards that you give, the amount of tiers, the length. And so you have something that's very consistent and predictable, which is perfect for AI. And so I think what we're going to start to see is a lot of AI being deployed into live ops to try to optimize a lot of the things that happens in live ops. And a lot of things that were formerly manual, that's very difficult for like a human producer or product manager to optimize. And whether that's like, sales and merchandising, whether that's figuring out how to price your IAP SKUs by geography, a lot of that is done manually today. And I think that's one of the areas where you're going to see AI being deployed into live ops a lot more strongly, especially probably next year. Okay, kind of a second idea for where you can try to gain competitive advantage or finding your alpha is this notion of product velocity. And I think that this is, when it comes to a startup, and you think about what are the biggest advantages of being in a startup, and I think that may be the scenario for many of you today in a small company, it's really about product velocity. How do you actually move as fast as you can? How do you move efficiently and effectively, given that many of you may be working at companies with limited resources? And so one of the ways to think about this is that, one is just characterizing all the specific steps in your product development process. So when you're making a game, what you want to do is you want to characterize all the different steps that are involved and then think about how do you speed that up. And that's certainly being turbocharged by AI, right? And so I would say 6 to 8 months ago, if I were to write a design spec for a game, it might take me, for a specific feature, it might take me 4 to 10 hours. But now with AI today, that same feature might take me only 30 minutes to an hour. And so when you think about all the specific workflow steps in your game development process, I think the companies that are going to win are the companies that increase the speed, increase the product velocity by thinking about how do we apply, whether it's AI or reconfigure your process steps so that you can move as quickly as possible. Now, the thing that AI can't do is tell you the direction, right? Because product velocity means speed and direction. That's something where AI is not so helpful today, but potentially more helpful in the future. But that's where you guys come in, right? And where you think about, okay, this is how we're differentiated. This is our specific strategy. And then you want to move as quickly as possible. And maybe the last thing I could talk about here is the notion of an organizational meta. Because I think that right now we are, because of AI, we're living in a new kind of age. And what I mean by the organizational meta is that if you play a game like League of Legends, there's a notion of a meta, meaning for a specific champion, the champion has certain abilities and powers. There's items that you can build, but there's specific weaknesses and strengths, constraints, prices of things. And so when you think about an organizational meta, what I'm saying is that the way that teams are architected, the way that you think about how you can be successful and maximally efficient and effective should change. And the reason it's going to change is because if you think about it, what does AI do? Well, it subsumes a lot of work. What kind of work? Well, I think it subsumes work on the low end and the high end. On the low end, it's about a lot of manual tasks. On the high end, it's a lot of very complex tasks. So if you think about, for example, I mentioned sales and merchandising, but for example, today, we have a very complex structure. So you can think about, when you're thinking about sales or pricing, you basically can think about it on 4 different levels, right? So you've got direct IAP sales. Underneath that, you have different sales bundles and offers. Below that, you have the battle pass. And below that, you have a web shop. In addition to that, you've got all the geographies that you are selling into. And so it's very, very difficult for a human product manager or producer to keep all of that in mind and to optimize all of that. But it is a lot easier for AI to do that. And so one of the things that I think we're continuing to see is that what AI is doing is it's taking a traditional role, like a product manager role or an artist role or an engineer's role, and it's starting to take different work and being able to do that work. And I think what the impact of that is going to be is that you will no longer have, in my opinion, a product manager. You're going to have somebody that does product management and maybe growth, or product management and engineering. So you're going to have a product marketer or a product or a product engineer. So you're going to have some of these roles compress. Roles compress, teams compress. And so there's going to be a function, I believe, where somebody needs to think about how do you create the most maximally efficient kind of organizational structure in your company. And I believe that the companies that do that well are going to win. And the companies that cannot do that, because you're a big company, you're used to doing things in a certain way, and you're very fixed, right? And so on the one side, you can be fully dynamic, and on the other side, you can have a company that's highly vertically sliced, where you're doing very specific kinds of work, and you're very rigid in terms of your organizational structure. And I believe that those are the companies that are going to lose. So it's not only about understanding your source of competitive advantage, but your team structure also should give you significant competitive advantage as well. Okay. All right, so now just kind of in closing, what I would submit to you is we are living in an age of uncertainty with so many changes, so much complexity in the industry today, and that so much is changing, and because of AI, I would say the things that we're going to see in terms of the next 2 to 3 years are going to kind of be like the number and impactful changes that we've seen over the last 15. And so that's why I wanted to give this presentation today, because I think that more game studios, more teams, more leaders need to think about the fact that we're operating in a new macro environment that's very competitive and very complex. And so then it goes back to thinking about this key question about what is your company's alpha? And I think that when I talk to many people in the games industry today, I don't get a very satisfying answer. And I would hope for all of you today to think about that more critically, especially given the fact that we do operate in this new kind of environment. And again, just to close, I started with this quote, but I really do hope that many of you think about this. Because again, it is, as Lynn C. Megginson stated, it is those companies that are able best to adapt and adjust that will survive. And others likely won't. And with that, that's it. All right, and so with that, if there's any questions, happy to take any questions. Can I give you guys this? Any questions? All right, we got one.
Can you give any examples of alpha or like a certain company's alpha, or like some case study or any company that you would know or something?
A case study of like a gaming company?
Yeah, like a gaming company, like what's their alpha? Like
Okay.
alpha, as you mentioned, it feels like a USP, but also like an ethic.
Well, you know, I would say, like, I was actually just talking about this with somebody over lunch, but one of the things that I did is, and this is not for the mobile gaming market, but just let's talk about gaming. So I looked at a lot of the games on Steam that were successful over the last 10 years. And one of the things that I noticed is that if you look at some of the games that have succeeded in the last year or two, there were games like Lethal Company, Schedule One, Phantasmagoria. And one of the things that I did is I looked at all these companies, and maybe with the exception of RV there, which was built very quickly, I noticed 3 traits that allowed these companies to be successful. The first is that these teams were very small, between 1 to 20 people. The second is that they actually developed over a very long period of time. And so between 3 to 8 years. And I actually wrote a post on this on Game Makers if you guys want to check it out, so you can see the very specific companies and a lot of the characteristics of those companies. And the third thing that they did is they engaged the community extremely highly. So in my opinion, I would say that if you're a Western game developer, and then there's going to be exceptions, right? There's going to be your like GTA 6, or you're going to have these big games that are very successful, but many of them, you can even say most of them, have failed. And so what I would say is that the new meta, the new source of alpha for, at least on the PC side, would be a company that adopts that model. And the old model of going to increasingly higher production value, increasingly higher fidelity, is not the path forward. You're at a competitive disadvantage relative to the small team that really just works with their community and just keeps iterating and iterating and iterating over time to get the product that the community wants. Any other questions?
Thank you.
Thanks, Joseph, for the session. My name is Kiran. I'm the founder of Snap Games. We're making instant games for social native platforms. Mm-hmm. My question is related to alpha for gaming companies. Like, we've seen a lot of innovation in content and technology, but distribution is always something which is the bottleneck most of the time. So are you seeing any examples or potential use cases of alpha in the distribution play, which is interesting?
Well, okay, so one thing, I do think that there are a number of ways that you can try to find an advantage in distribution. So the first way is that, so if you're a big company, so I'm actually friends with the Century Games guys. I used to work with those guys in the past. And one of the things that they have realized is that creative concepts are critical for success in terms of giving you, higher CTR, higher IPM. And that team, the team at Century Games that works on Whiteout Survival, they have over 300 people just for creative concepts, right? And so they are playing to win on distribution. And they've pushed out their payback windows to increasingly longer and longer periods of time. Why? Because they basically want to freeze out any competitor. And so if you're a 4X company trying to compete against them, well, they're going to be able to outscale you in terms of creative concepts and in terms of payback period. So they're trying to do the game of war approach where they're just acquiring a lot of the user acquisition. The other way to think about competing in distribution is also from a monetization perspective, right? And so if we look back on what Game of War did, they had higher monetization. I mean, that's one of the things that we're trying at Lila, is that one of the reasons we decided to go after extraction shooter is we thought that we could take some monetization concepts from 4X and bring it into shooter. It's a big risk. I don't know if we'll be successful or not, but that's one of the things that we're trying. But if you can find, and this is also one of the things that we're seeing with the shift from casual to hybrid casual, is that if you can create a game with slightly better monetization than existing games in that specific subgenre or genre that you're competing, then you can outspend your competitors, right? And you can push your payback windows further. Now, you're going to have confidence that your models are correct. And so the other thing that would also imply is that you would have really good data. And so it becomes very important that you are statistically sound. I'm not saying statistical significance, but that you can trust your data pipeline and you can trust your models. And if you can do it in a way that is highly predictive, then that would give you an advantage relative to your other competitors because it allows you to spend on your marketing with confidence. Does that make sense? But those are some of the key areas. But I also see, as I mentioned before when we were talking about growth, this is one of the areas that AI is being deployed a lot in terms of automation, in terms of trying to figure out different ways that you can come up with creative concepts and things like that, so you don't have to have that 300-person team.
Thank you.
Okay, I think we have a question in the back.
Hey, Joseph.
Hello.
Very insightful session. I work at product in Moonfrog Labs. My
Great.
question was mostly regarding what you told about Brawl Stars and Clash Royale. I've been a long player of Clash Royale on and off for the last decade or so. This is something which I have noticed also, that there's a lot of content that they've added into a game that it's becoming more and more complex as time is passing. So my insight on that was the trend that is upcoming in Supercell is they're focusing more on enriching content for the existing users rather than focusing on getting new users. Is this something that you're also noticing in the industry?
Well, I think there's two things, right? And so I think from a Supercell perspective, what they did with Brawl Stars, in my opinion, is that they really leaned into events and IP collaborations, right? And so with like the Godzilla event that they ran last year was like a massive success. And so I think I would probably argue that that's a little bit more for keeping gameplay fresh for existing players, but also trying to bring in new players as well. But then to your point, I would say Clash Royale is probably more for existing players, because I think what happened with Clash Royale is that many of their players experienced getting to the progression frontier. And so when you're near the progression frontier, there's not much else to do. And so I believe what they did, and I haven't played Clash Royale for a long time, so I'm not 100% sure, but when I did look at it, what I believe they did is they added a lot of new progression systems, and then they tried to reactivate a lot of their old players, right? And so, and this kind of goes back to being able to compete from a live ops perspective, right? But those companies that understand their game, and the fact that Clash Royale did have a lot of players that got to a progression frontier, and because they got there, they either churned out or they just didn't have much to do. So when you added those additional progression vectors, and then you try to reactivate a lot of old players, they were then able to 6x their revenue. Okay, and I think my time's up. Thank you guys for coming. Hopefully this was informative. And if anyone has any questions, you can hit me up. Thanks, everyone.